Well, our recess is over, and I hope you had a good lunch, and we're ready to begin our work this afternoon. At last month's meeting, Vice President Henderson spoke about the value of establishing consortium to focus on research, on a research topic of common interest to the state. Just a second. I need a little water. Vice President Anderson spoke about the value of establishing consortium to focus on a research topic of common interest to the state. This afternoon, we are pleased to welcome a guest speaker who has considerable experience in leading similar efforts in California's biotech world. And Susan, would you come up and join us right now, please? Susan Baxter is the Executive Director of California State University's Program for Education and Research in Biotechnology, also known as CBIRB. C-Superb. Also known as C-Superb. In this role, she's responsible for strategic planning and new initiatives related to life sciences across the 23 campuses of the CSU system. CPIRB was created in 1987 to support multi-campus collaboration and to foster active learning statewide in California. Today, the program provides seed funding for researchers, emerging academic entrepreneurs, and curriculum designers. It convenes an annual biotechnology symposium and partners with industry on workforce development projects. Dr. Baxter is here to explain how CPIRB is structured, how campuses benefit, and how the community plays a role in strategic initiatives. Following her presentation, we'll again have an opportunity for questions and discussion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Baxter.
So thank you very much to President Cross and Vice President Henderson for the invitation to be here today. It's quite an opportunity for me to share what we've learned in California, but also to learn how things work in Wisconsin, so it's a good experience for me as well. Thank you. Following Michael Crow, I had to jot down some numbers. So the California State University system is the largest public four-year public institution in the nation with 23 campuses. We have 474,000 students enrolled across the state of California. We graduate about 100,000 per year. That's 3 million alumni across the nation. And we're made up primarily of regional comprehensive universities and primarily undergraduate institutions. And so that's the focus of my talk. We're a little less research one focused than ASU. But I will say, and the number I jotted down was that across the 23 campuses, we do bring in about $540 million in research expenditures. So in aggregate, it's a significant amount of research going on across the campuses. So I was asked to talk about our system-wide community for biotechnology. And I'm going to try to do that in 30 minutes, and that they say that we have about 30 minutes for you to ask more questions. So if I glide over the surface, hopefully you'll ask questions at the end. I can go a little bit deeper. So the title I put on the talk was A Community of Interest, Learning, and Practice. So a community is a structure or a framework for a collaborative entity that would cross campuses and involve students and faculty from across a region like a state of California or the state of Wisconsin. So there is a book that I read by Wenger, McDermott, and Snyder when I took this job a decade ago. And I picked it back up off the shelf to get ready for this talk, and I'll say, wow, does it actually reflect my learned experience over the last decade? And so everything in that book is instructive, and I would highly recommend it to you if you think this framework will end up working for you as well. So It's called Cultivating Communities of Practice. It's based on scholarship from the cultural anthropology and organizational management theory world, and so it's nothing new. People have been talking about communities of practice for a long time. But the idea is that a community of practice might provide faculty support, it might incubate new programs, new ideas, it might bring together faculty from different disciplines and students to learn across the interfaces of disciplines. It can serve as an on-ramp to reduce learning curves for faculty or administrators anywhere in the state around a particular domain. And of course, today I'm here talking about biotechnology, which is a domain of its own that I'll talk a little bit more about. So as a disclaimer, being an academic, I have to put a disclaimer on the floor. So what I'm going to describe, what we've done, may or may not work in a different context. Our community of practice started 30 years ago with different motivations than you have today around the table when you're considering starting one for strategic reasons of your own. But hopefully there will be lessons learned and some promising practices that you'll learn. So the point of a community practice is to build an organization's overall capacity for learning, not necessarily doing. And we'll come back to that theme a little bit more. So what do we do? I think as you're reading the introduction, we provide seed grant funding. So our strategies of how we've evolved is we use the seed grant funding mechanism. We fund researchers and educators at all 23 of our campuses. We convene an annual symposium, which brings together industry experts, legislators, professors from different places in the country and the world working in the biotechnology field. We sponsor industry responsive curriculum, and by what I'll define a little bit more, we were based on active learning. We're going to come back to that. So hands-on learning in the STEM disciplines is exceedingly important for learning and student engagement, but it's also equally important to the employers after graduation, because you can hit the ground running in research and biotechnology if you've done these things, if you've been a practitioner as an undergraduate. So bringing industry together in our annual meeting, and as we talk about trends in the industry, that helps inform how we put together curriculum and new projects and new research directions. And then we also serve as a liaison for the CSU with government and educational partners across the state and the nation. So to define our domain, biotechnology as we define it reflects the industry as a whole. So it's not just molecular biology or DNA science. It ranges from molecular devices involving bioengineers and physicists perhaps, to molecular biologists, but also to business people and people working in the clinical sciences, especially that's important for product development in the biotechnology world. So we span many disciplines, and we're not focused on any one particular aspect of biomedical science. We cover ag, we cover medical sciences, we cover blue biotechnology, they call it, environmental engineering and things like that, monitoring. So as an example of how these things knit together in my world, I serve on the industry association boards in California. There's one in Northern California called California Life Sciences Association, and one in Southern California called the Biocom. And so by serving on that board, I can work with them on this labor market analysis. And so there was a wonderful report from the 2016 National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine called Promising Practices for Strengthening Regional STEM Workforces. And one of the things they recommended that universities and industry work together to look at workforce development and what the coming needs would be. Well, we've been doing this for the last 8 years in California. So we publish a workforce trend report called the Talent Integration Report is what they've called it these last 2 years. And what we found is that both policy leaders and employers alike think that the universities are doing a good job providing subject matter training, but new graduates also need cross-disciplinary communication, teamwork, critical thinking, and collaboration skills, all things that the educators in the room are nodding their head. We've heard this before. Undergraduates and graduate students, we think, are guaranteed to develop these skills while working on inclusive, well-designed, authentic research and entrepreneurship experiences and internships. These are high-impact practices that are known to engage students and help them persist towards degrees, but they're also something that employers want desperately. So these are skills, lifelong learning skills, that if we can get them into the undergraduate education, that's a win for everybody in the state around biotechnology. And so in turn, this informs what CSUPERB funds. So it's a virtuous cycle, we hope. So the motivations back 30 years ago for starting CSUPERB were due to the employment landscape in California. So biotechnology is one of the largest industries in our state. Today it employs almost 300,000 different people, and then if you use the multiplier, it's even larger. It's multidisciplinary, like I talked before. It's ranging from medical devices all the way to pharmaceutical development, and then also environmental monitoring is becoming a very large deal. So we started where we were. The reason that biotechnology was chosen is because that's what the jobs in the industry and how it was developing. And at that point, biotechnology 30 years ago was changing very rapidly from a pharmaceutical aspect to more of the biopharmaceutical. And I'll talk about the science ad nauseum, so I'll stop there. The second thing we had was that we had a critical mass of people, faculty and students in the university who were already doing research or were interested in biotechnology-related areas of expertise. Our problem was they were spread out across 23 different campuses. And so bringing them together around a problem was what started. And usually this is where I stop the story. I just talk about those two reasons for the motivation, but I was in Wisconsin today, so I'll tell you the real story. So the faculty were dealing with this transition from biology to microbiology. In the old days, you used to use pipettes with bulbs, and you could transfer milliliters of things, or you could pour something like a cup at a time. When you do molecular biology, you need to transfer microliters of things. And the way that was done was with a pipette man. And I don't know if you know, but this was a University of Wisconsin medical college researcher who started Gilman Industries. And at the time, in CSU, they could not afford the pipette men enough to teach molecular biology labs at the scale that they wanted to do it. And so they were trying to band together the faculty who were teaching molecular biology so they could get a purchasing discount from Gilman, was the hope. So that was the real story for the beginning of CSUPERB, as it's been told to me. So, timeline. So this was a community motivated by needing to buy pipette men at the start. And it was a faculty-driven grassroots effort. It wasn't a top-down idea, let's get together and buy pipette men and teach molecular biology in a more effective and engaging way. It was faculty at different campuses across the CSU that came together. There were passionate faculty, I'll say that, because you don't get a long-lived community without having a passion about what you're doing. The founders were from CSU Los Angeles, Joe Bragan, Krellin Pauling at San Francisco State, Steve Doms at San Diego State, Bob Cook from Fullerton, and Jill Adler-Moore at Cal Poly Pomona. These were some of the leaders. Jill is actually still involved in CSUPERB, and she is sort of the model for the faculty who are involved in CSUPERB. And I'll tell her story just very briefly. She's one of the faculty who throughout her career has partnered with small and large biotechnology companies in the state of California. She's taken sabbatical and actually spent a summer working in a lab. And she was a co-inventor of the liposome encapsulated antifungal drug called Biosome, which is sold by Gilead Sciences today worldwide. She's a professor at Cal Poly Pomona, primarily undergraduate institution in the eastern part of the state. She continues to work and has funding from NIH and NSF to do microbial and vaccine development in her lab. And she's listed as an inventor on 16 patents. She's a AAAS fellow. But the thing she's most proud of is the hundreds of students that she's trained at the undergraduate bachelor's level and at the master's level. They've gone on to people, the biotechnology companies in the LA area in particular. So it's this idea of a very engaged faculty with a very engaged set of students that can come up with really incredible inventions and innovations and scientific breakthroughs. And Jill really epitomizes the spirit behind the founding of C Superb. And the literature on communities of practice say that it needs to be rooted in an intrinsic motivation, and in C Superb's case, it was this professional pride and passion of being an engaged scholar and teacher. So going back to the beginning, there was these engaged faculty. They talked, they bought pipette men, they taught molecular biology, and just like what Michael Crow was talking about when he was talking about his Innovative Campuses project, as a community practice, they started sharing, they started actually valuing the time they spent together and learning from each other. This learning community idea was what became the nucleus for C Superb. And so Chancellor Reynolds chartered the program as the first system-wide program, I believe. There are actually now quite a number, over 20 different system-wide groups across the CSU. It's sort of become part of our DNA, if you will, of how we operate and how faculty gain critical mass and learn from each other. But it was really the tipping point probably was in 1999 when the state recognized the organization as a statewide entity and then added on to, other than buying things and sharing things across the teaching practice, they also wanted us to focus on maintaining and enhancing the biotechnology workforce, so we took on a little bit more of a workforce development angle. So in the short-term goals, it's very typical for a community practice to start around improving how we work. That's a very typical way that you start. And then when you evolve over time, you become more strategic and you can foster professional development and solve bigger strategic problems as you mature. And indeed, that's what's happened across C Superb. We began adopting 3-year strategic plans. We actually have to get them approved by the chancellor now every 3 to 5 years. But this ability to execute on a strategic plan is one of the hallmarks of a successful community of practice. The other thing is to be able to foresee developments and take advantage of emerging opportunities, and I want to go into some of that as well. So talking about how to root it in a long-term way. So a community of interest comes together around buying pipette men, a shared interest. But it evolves because people see professional advantages by talking and sharing and being with their colleagues and learning from each other. Then it can evolve into solving problems, and that's where it becomes kind of exciting and new and different. And then a community of action is the top of the heap when you see a problem or you see something that you can address and you mobilize together to have an effect and transform things. So just to define some terms. The way we work is rooted in that grassroots history. So it's a faculty organization, it's a faculty-run organization. The first level of governance that we have is what I call the faculty consensus, well, I don't call it, it's called the faculty consensus group. I call it a congress of sorts. We have 4 representatives from each of the campuses that are appointed by the presidents to serve on this. And from that group, we elect a strategic planning council that involves both faculty and deans. And then there's a president's commission. 7 of the 23 presidents are put onto the commission. And then I report to the chancellor through that president's commission. In a community of practice, you wouldn't be called an executive director, you would be called a coordinator, and that's very true about my job. It's a lot of coordination across the state. So the governance structures work together around our mission, and I'll read our mission today, is to develop a professional biotechnology workforce by mobilizing and supporting collaborative CSU student and faculty research, by innovating educational practices, and by partnering with the life sciences industry. So it's intentional that we're going to involve industry in the things that we do. So we pay a lot of attention to state, national, and system-wide strategic priorities. We work with proven partners. We foster these cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary collaborations and projects. And we promote high-impact practices, which in our world, what we refer to mostly are research, entrepreneurship, education, and internships, because they have a very real effect on jobs after and life after graduation and beyond the university. So those are the skills, the teamwork skills that employers are seeking. We also have talked at length about the focus on student-centeredness. We have evolved quite a lot in the last 6 years about that. I think I listened to a NASH workshop, National Association of Systems Heads webinar a couple weeks ago about high-impact practices, and the Virginia Commonwealth University presented some things that they had learned about their high-impact practices, and that most people were motivated at the beginning to make sure they had equity and access. So in other words, will all of the undergraduate students at your university have an undergraduate research experience like we heard this morning? That's an equity or an access motivation. There's also a student success, which a lot of times is defined as simply graduating or completing a degree, and in our world we talk about, and then do they go on and use their degree post-graduation? And from a workforce development in the STEM fields like biotechnology, we're equally happy if students go on to graduate school or medical school or get a job in the industry. We count all three of those as wins in our category. And then the last thing that VCU defined is an attention to quality of education. And that's exactly where C-Superb is right now. We're really focusing on the effective STEM education practices and what really matters in the classroom and towards a degree. So over the 10 years necessary to drive a change of perspective and conversation, I have seen old conversations about research versus education go away. Our name is actually indicative of the way we've evolved. So this horrible long acronym that I have, C-Superb, stands for Research and Education in Biotechnology. When I started the job, those were two different pillars and they didn't cross over very often. Now they're completely enmeshed, and that does reflect the National Science Foundation's recommendations of bringing research into the classroom and making sure students are engaged by cutting-edge thought and scholarship. Gateway attitudes about remediation and student preparedness. We've moved past that. We're focusing on where the students are and engaging them in research as early as we can because we know that pays off. They end up being engaged and seeing themselves as scientists and engineers as early in their career as possible. And so they slide through and excel at the gateway courses when they actually can see that it matters to making progress as a scientist or an engineer. Our conversations about pedagogy and student engagement are common, and I think that what's most telling is that C-Superb faculty across the system have a view beyond the laboratory. They tend to be more connected to their communities. They do community-based service or service learning. They tend to do partnered research projects with water districts around the state. And they work on real problems, even in the clinics, around diabetes, effectiveness and treatment, and things like that. So it's a generational change from an inward PI-focused culture, principal investigator, to a more multidisciplinary, collaborative, community-facing and interacting attitude, I'd say, or culture that we have within C-Superb. So the key to a successful community practice over the long haul is that governing bodies are not advisory or an honorary gathering of people. They actually roll up their sleeves and they work. So our faculty consensus group, they get together in August every year and we figure out what we want to fund in the coming year and we change our request for proposals, but they also review the proposals that come in. The presidents who sit on my President's Commission board, they have to review our annual budget and our operating plans, but they also have to sell it to the chancellor for approval. So that's also the feeding back of the community, means that people are engaged and they have ownership over what happens and what goes on across the group. Community of practice health depends on participation being voluntary, and that's a point I'll leave as well. So how do you do all this over 30 years? For about $1 million a year. Our budget's relatively flat since I've been in the system. It goes up and down with external grant funds that we bring in. The point here of the graph and all the bars stacked up here for you is that the support has been reliable over time. That's the absolutely most important thing to a vibrant community practice. So we go up and down because when we pilot new ideas, we look for external grants to pilot. And I'll talk about the CSU I-Corps program and entrepreneurship education program. We have started that with grant funding in hopes that we institutionalize it on the back end. So this is what's called a coordinated investment in infrastructure, pure and simple. This is something, a little bit of money over a long period of time with a consistent support can lead to culture change and support for faculty that couldn't have been done otherwise. So how do the campuses benefit? Because as Wenger says, if it's not clear to the members how they're going to benefit, they won't participate, and participation, it has to be voluntary. So what we decided to settle upon is the seed grant model. So voluntary is voluntary, but if you put a little bit of money on the table, people who might not have seen themselves getting involved might actually come to the table. And then likewise, our goal, our strategic goal, is to build the research capacity and involve more students. And so if we seed something, we hope that it will go on to become institutionalized or sustainable or grant funded by a different agency. So on the whole, we make about, we get enough proposals in each year to fund about 30% of them. They're peer reviewed by faculty across the system, and so it's competitive. It's not any kind of formulation that you just give out automatically. You do have to compete for it. We receive proposals and make awards to all the campuses across the 23, across the system. Again, these are primarily undergraduate universities. On average, we fund about 30% of them, and who applies and who wins every year changes year to year, and we publish this data in our annual report. So another thing that's key to a vibrant and long-lived community practice is that these things are transparent and people can see how the money is being spent. So does it work? I come from the business world. I was used to venture capital, where you're looking for a 1 to 4 return on investment. And I'd have to say, yes, it works beyond any kind of expectation I had going in. For every dollar we invest, the PIs go on and win about $13.5 million here, averaged over the last couple years. So again, these are tiny bits of money. They're $15,000 seed grants. This is not a lot of money. So why does that translate into such a huge return on investment? Looking at other seed grant programs around the country, you can expect 1 to 8, 1 to 10 is usually typical. And again, the follow-on funding is spotty. It's not always going to work, right? Just like venture capital, some things do fail in science. Some things do fail in the projects that you take on, but a vibrant community will take risks. A vibrant community will try things and hit for the stadium and hit for the cheap seats, right? So you expect things not to always work. But that got munged. So the point I want to make, which isn't necessarily about money, is that the return on investment really can't be the whole story. It really needs to be a little bit more about the faculty and the community and the student impacts that accrue. So benefits to community members might be help with challenges they're facing, access to expertise, confidence in their professional identity, a sense of belonging, enhanced professional reputation, and a forum for expanding skills and expertise. So the greatest values here are in the intangibles. They're not something you can count. The leaves on the trees here say things like research discoveries, but also new courses, new collaborations, new innovative pedagogies, new partners, a student-founded new company, community partnerships and publications, and joint ventures. These are the things that really you wait for. That's what you look for out of a successful community practice. So the relationships are the most important things, and that's why the follow-on funding will come in spots as the relationships and the partnerships and the collaborations gel and they work and they find problems worth solving. So communities of practice come together to share experiences and expertise and improve themselves professionally. So our new PIs come into the system, their deans tell them apply for a CSUPR grant, it'll augment your startup funds, whatever that package was. You'll get $15,000. What happens then, we use them in the peer reviews going forward, so they learn how to be a reviewer on a grant cycle before they go to NSF or NIH. They learn how to write proposals. We can align the researchers with the problems or the federal funding priorities or the community issues that we want to solve or work on. The annual symposium brings everyone together, fostering collaboration and sharing practices and things that didn't work. And they join this nurturing community without worried about tenure, promotion. It's what they call a neutral community. It's a safe spot, but it's also somewhere they can learn from each other. I have this problem on my campus. Well, actually, we don't have this problem at my campus. There must be a workaround. There must be a way you can approach that in a more pragmatic fashion. So these are some of the intangibles as well that go into it. But the real thing we want to look at is it helping? Remember, we have a workforce development focus. So how is it affecting our students? So 83% of the grant funds that we give out do support undergraduates working in research labs or in community-based projects or in clinics around the state. And we did a project this summer where we looked for where are they now. We lost about 12% of them, but we could find the rest of them that we funded over the last 5 years. About 700 students we're looking at here. And this number was, this graph is hard to read from where you're sitting, but the point is that about 90% of them continued on in a degree-relevant career path. I'm just going to stop there and say yay, right? I think that's incredible. These students, though, had research experience. They had done internships. They had been on an I-Corps entrepreneurship education cohort. They've gone in and they've done cutting-edge research, solved problems. So the vast majority go on, get a job in the biotech industry. The second tranche there is they go on to doctoral level programs. And again, we count both of those as huge wins. So as a proxy for the teaching that we're doing in the CSU and the faculty mentors that we've developed in our community of practice, this is the outcome that we were looking for and hoping for, and something we can point to. And this is something that we've learned together, how to be good mentors. We've learned together how to work with students who are the first in their family to come to college. We've learned together how to talk to families about, yes, your student is going to go to classes, but we're also going to ask them to do things extracurricular or co-curricular that will increase their chances for employment or admission into graduate school or medical school after they're done. So vibrant system-wide program can support strategic initiatives. These are some of ours. We want to embed research across the curriculum. We want to involve undergraduate researchers. We want to work with the community on partnerships. You will have different motivations, but the strategies in a vibrant community of practice can come from the top, it can come from the middle, and it can come from the bottom. And that's why I'm going to try to show you 3 case studies of how this might work. So the advantage of a vibrant and engaged system-wide program is that you can take balls lobbed at you from all different directions and respond to them creatively, we hope. And so the first one I was going to talk about is a community of inquiry. So California really wanted to be the lead in stem cell biology. And so the problem presented to CSUPERB was not one of pipettemen this time. It was how do we train people in these new emerging stem cell programs. And so we got together and we talked about how would we do a training program around stem cell science. And knowing that our primarily undergraduate and comprehensives don't have a very deep bench yet of stem cell scientists, we partnered with Research One universities across the state and put a proposal into the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine to start a new training program. And so this is the Bridges program that's been in place for about 7 years now. We as an organization, as a system-wide program, we advocated for this program with CERM and with our legislators. We hosted proposal writing workshops for universities, both the UC and the CSU and the California community colleges when this call for proposals came out. We brokered partnerships between the Research One and our campuses. And we raised awareness of what the workforce needs were in the stem cell field. $83 million later, we have a map that looks like this. So not only have we trained nearly 1,000 students in these kind of techniques in this research background, but they're also coming to graduate school at Wisconsin, and they're going to graduate school all over the world. So these are what we think is a win and a response to the CSUPERB. We were able to look for the workforce and produce a new workforce in a new field. Secondly, community of action. So focus about bringing change. I think Michael Crow talked about culture change this morning. I don't think I'm going to be able to do that great of a job to talk about a system-wide change or a campus-based change like he talked about. But one of the large changes that stakeholders on the national level have been talking about is a reform of how undergraduate biology is taught. And so a lot of the themes I've been talking about today is engaged learning and active learning, and letting students be scientists and engineers in their first year or their second year instead of waiting until their capstone experience. And these are concepts that are pulled from the 2009 Vision and Change report. support. So C-Superb leadership decided this is something we should embrace. It required changes in approaches to instruction. It requires changes in how the subject's taught, core competencies, and scaffolded into the curriculum. It's a big change to undergraduate research. And C-Superb decided we would champion it and have workshops about it and have discussions about it and share what we're learning. And we were rewarded by being the centerfold, if you will, of the new Vision and Change report, talking about how a community of practice could actually influence and change in how a subject matter is taught at the university level. So this also has been something, and we're not done. Changing patterns of instruction based on how learning takes place is a moving target, and we're learning as we go. But the community of practice is a great place. At the symposium, we have 4 different workshops on what people are doing to put high-impact practices into the undergraduate curriculum, but also to scaffold them so all students have access to these opportunities. And then finally, you have to have students. So my third example is a student stakeholder strategy. So the students came to us about 7 years ago and said, we really want to learn more about the business of biotechnology. We want to learn how to start companies. We want to learn about entrepreneurship. We're not getting that in our science classes. And so it was the students, not the faculty this time, who said, C-Superb, can you help? Can you come up with some program that we can latch onto? So we actually partnered with the University of Texas's I2P program, and we developed a program for C-Superb that involved student teams taking research-based ideas and doing an exploration of the market. Is there a market for my great idea? The answer is oftentimes no, but the experience is priceless. It's a high-impact practice. They have a project that they can talk about, and then when they go and interview or they go to graduate school, they have a much more realistic view of the gap between undergraduate education and how the workplace actually works in the biotechnology field. I'm hoping that my sound is working okay. Someone's going to say, I can't hear me if it's not working. Okay. We've gone on to win National Science Foundation funding for the I2P program. We now call it CSU I-Core. We've had about 7 cohorts go through the program. It's part of the National Innovation Network. These programs are spread out all over the nation now. NIH, NSF, Department of Defense, University, USDA, all are sponsoring I-Core as an entrepreneurship education for researchers nationwide. We're just one of many nodes. I think that the thing that we're hoping is that one of my colleagues is from MIT, and Roman Lubinsky and his colleagues at the venture arm of MIT did a study that showed that biotechnology or biomedical research-based ideas usually take about $7 million in 10 years to become commercializable, right? So to have a student, an undergraduate student, say, I have this idea and take it all the way to the product is not necessarily realistic. You know, if it's a university spin out over time, that can happen. But what it is doing is reducing the gap between awareness. So how research is done in the university versus how research is done in the pharmaceutical industry or in the biotech industry. But also it's raising the awareness and changing the culture on our campuses and the faculty. So this is a strategic change that came from the students, and it's bubbling up through the faculty, and now we're seeing more faculty engagement and interest in at least learning to partner to advance ideas to patients. And that's something that for a primarily undergraduate or a regional comprehensive, that's a conversation that's very exciting to see. But remember, Jill Adler-Moore has already done it 15 years ago, so it can be done, and it is something that can happen. So what does it take to do this? The challenges are always communication. There's one coordinator. I communicate with people one-on-one by phone, by email, 700 at a time at the symposium, in peer review, grant funding, all sorts of ways you communicate, and you can still never communicate enough to keep everybody in sync. You still have someone come to a meeting and they've never heard of a high-impact practice, or a new president will come on board and say, why are you doing entrepreneurship education? So you do have to re-justify and make sure people understand your strategy and where you're trying to go, and that can change over time. Needing to justify the program and strategies to an ever-changing administrative cohort And the quote from Wenger is, "If the community's value to the organization as a whole is not understood, it is difficult to justify investing resources in the community and to legitimize its voice." That's a quote to remember. So re-justifying what we're doing and why we're doing and how it's changing students' career trajectories and how it's changing the way research is done and how we can pull together our critical mass around problems worth solving is a conversation I have a lot. It requires a big picture, strategic, long-term perspective, and the other danger is to avoid a fixed definition. C superb is, and getting stuck there for too long. It needs to evolve. So let the community that you form in Wisconsin evolve naturally as best you can. Seed the people who sort of have their hands up and let it evolve from there. Let it be voluntary, don't force it. Welcome a variety of participation levels, of interest, of learning, of practice, of action. Have different touch points to come in and out of. Hopefully you can sustain it over a long period of time. Sustaining comes from, yes, support, but sustaining also comes from energy from within. And if you lose that energy or that activation or that interest or that passion, communities will die and go away. And that's okay, actually, as well. Most communities of practice only last about 10 years, they say. C superb is very unusual that it's lasted 30 years, but it's because we've evolved and because we've had different problems and issues to solve. And then allow sense-making of complex issues. There's nothing like higher education to make things complicated, right? But biotechnology in particular is particularly complicated, and so as graduating students that reflect the demographics of your state is a complicated thing. So having a place to come and share these kind of ideas and compare notes is immensely valuable that doesn't fall in any balance sheet that I've seen. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any other questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Baxter. It's interesting, Wisconsin is the origin of many initiatives, and it's interesting that a pipette that was invented here was the origin of this. So
you never know,
that's a
right?
little known fact. All right. Do we have some questions for Dr. Baxter? Yes. Regent Mueller?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. We're always interested in following the money, and I see that you've been very successful in getting funding from external funding agencies, that particular chart. Are you talking here about primarily federal or state grants, or does this also include funding from the private sector, from business?
Yeah, all of the above, but primarily about 86% of it is NSF or NIH following funding, grant funds. Yeah. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes.
Again, very impressive. Congratulations. I'm wondering, within the CSU...
Do you need a mic? We need a microphone.
All right.
Thank you.
Again, to repeat, thank you very much for your presentation and congratulations. And I am a double CSU alum, by the way, Humboldt and San Francisco. Yay. I'm just curious, are there other communities of practice within the CSU around different disciplines, and how are those going?
Yes. There is a very successful COAST. It's also an acronym. I should be able to, and I can't. But it's focused on coastal issues of water, algae blooms, a lot of different climate change, water levels, all that kind of research and regulatory touch points. Most of their work is with the state agencies and in some ways NOAA and things like that. So that's the COAST group. There's also a water, WRPI, Water Resources and Policy Initiative. And they're much more, less research, but more policy, and they work with the state quite a lot. They just won a very large contract to help inform water policy with the new water bond that was passed in California. And then there's an agricultural research initiative as well. And so all of the four groups I just listed, we do overlap a little bit depending on the project and the personnel involved. And that's been okay with the system so far, recognizing that these things do move and evolve over time as the science and the problems change. So those are just some of the research-based, but overall I believe there are 22 different system-wide programs. So also around other scholarship areas. A Strategic Language Institute is one, and that was a partnership, I believe, with Armed Forces and the State Department. So for lots of different reasons, these communities have formed and persisted, or they've grown and gone away with a project or a short-term goal.
As a follow-up, do you believe that these efforts have enhanced your ability to bring in external funding?
Without question on the biotechnology side. I know COAST also has a follow-on funding strategy, a seed grant strategy. I think WRPI, for instance, has more of a strategy about informing policy and solving some joint goals with the state. So they're not quite focused on development fundings per se. But I think that part of the art of a successful community practice is to define your domain and define your goals at the beginning and evolve as they go. So I don't think any of the successful communities of practice that I know of around the CSU and in academia traveling nationwide, it can't be just about the money, right? Yeah. But I think it's the partnerships, it's the multidisciplinarity. Those are the reasons that you're successful, and that's also engaging to faculty and students. And so it's just a whole ball of wax.
I have a question. When you talked about the origin and you also talked about how it evolved, you talked about the first step is a common need, in this case a common need to acquire. In some of the other groups that you talked about, was there a common need there, and what is it possible to initiate this from the outside, working with the faculty, working organically toward the inside?
I think the answers are all of the above. There
In
are
other words,
examples.
you can do it.
You can do it, right? I think that the commonality in the literature when you read it or when you talk to people is that passion. That there's a coalescing force of some sort. I think that I'm trying to think of a good example for you from somewhere from outside.
Mm-hmm.
That's the hardest one.
Yeah. In other words, if you could bring together from the outside, bring together common interests within the different institutions.
Well, I
then
think
you can create, you can foster that or seed that.
yes, I think that the vision and change example is that's a good example. I think within the CSU we had been talking about high impact practices and active learning and scientific teaching and things like that. But when the report came from the federal side and said, we really need to scale this, this is important to STEM education as a whole, the faculty were halfway there, and this helped make the goals a little bit more ambitious, a little bit more urgent. And so yes, it's the meeting from the outside and the inside, that's a great motivating factor.
Initiated the will on the inside and then the prompting from the outside.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Other questions? I believe other questions from the chancellors? I believe President Cross had a few comments to make.
Well, I just want to speak a little bit about what is the system's role in facilitating this, and that's one of the reasons we invited Susan here. We have a number of the chancellors over here have a number the comprehensives I'm focusing on now. We have a number of undergraduate research activities, which is one of the high impact practices. There's and something we're trying to do is, what is the role of system to expand that, to facilitate that, or should there be no role? That's a fair question. And as it relates to the comprehensives, which is Cal State's kind of institution, and how could that in fact interact with the needs of the state, the outside pressures that the state has, and complement without interfering what's occurring at our one institutions, and is that appropriate? So that's kind of the question we're grappling with, and we wanted to listen to how California State's working on this from a system perspective. That's the impetus for this discussion. And I think I picked up a few things here, and it probably is going to require that we sit around and ponder this a bit, but I just wanted to give you a little background while we're thinking
Thank
about
you.
that.
Yeah.
Once again, Dr. Baxter, thank
Thank
you
you.
very
Thank you,
much.
thank you.
At this time, we turn our attention to the annual presentation of the UW System's federal priorities. There are several key issues that we anticipate could impact the UW system in the coming year, and that includes student financial aid, the reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, constrained research for research and constrained resources for research and development, competent-based education, and the growing regulatory burden on colleges and universities. Those are a lot of issues. There have been changes in Washington, and we need to be able to deal with them. So here, to begin this, is a presentation of an overview of the UW System's key federal priorities for 2017. I want to welcome Chris Andrews, Associate Vice President for Federal Relations. Welcome, Chris. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Regina Milner, and good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me here today. I really appreciate it. So I'm going to start by talking about how we put our federal priorities together. So every year, the UW System Office of Federal Relations, we prepare a report outlining the system's agenda of federal priorities for the upcoming year. The purpose of the report is twofold. One, we want to update the Board of Regents on the federal landscape and where the UW system is focusing its efforts and attention. And two, while we regularly communicate with our congressional delegation and staff year-round, this report really serves as a roadmap for where we want to be proactive and articulate the UW system's position and agenda relative to key issues that we see coming before the federal Congress. So prior to being submitted to the board for adoption, this agenda goes through a fairly thorough review. It's reviewed at several levels throughout the system. We look back at what the priorities were for the previous year. We solicit the input and advice and recommendations from system institutions, as well as our UW experts who work in these thorny public policy areas. We also work with our national associations to ensure that the UW system's agenda aligns, where possible, with our national higher ed organizations. And then we take into consideration the political landscape, present and future, and we help determine what are some reasonable expectations where there are the best opportunities, where the best opportunities lie for the University of Wisconsin system to make a difference for public higher education. So following this meeting today, the next step will be to deliver these priorities to members of our congressional delegation and staff and other external stakeholders. So I'm going to do a little bit of a review from 2016, and as most of you know, little tends to happen legislatively in election years, and that was certainly true in the past year. 2016 left a lot of unfinished business. So to briefly recap, Congress eventually passed a continuing resolution that provides government funding at current levels to all government agencies through April of 2017 after only one of its annual appropriations bills, Military Affairs and Veterans, was approved through regular order. The bill included significant funding for the National Institutes of Health to begin implementing the 21st Century Cures Act, and it also included investments to help states address the opioid epidemic. But because the continuing resolution only runs through April, the new Congress and the administration still have to finalize last year's spending plans while also working on appropriations measures for the upcoming year. The 2017 National Defense Act was signed into law. It included the Manufacturing Universities Act. You will recall that President Cross and Kurt Bauer, the president and CEO of the Manufacturers and Commerce, co-signed a letter asking Congress to include this provision in order to strengthen engineering programs and partnerships. The measure currently awaits funding. The American Innovation and Competitiveness Act was signed into law. The bill included a new section improving undergraduate STEM experiences that was the result of efforts by the Council on Undergraduate Research, CUR, and UW System to improve STEM retention and grow the STEM workforce. Much of our time was spent lobbying on a U.S. Department of Labor overtime rule that would have significantly raised the salary threshold under which employees, including many employees of colleges and universities, would be eligible for overtime pay. The UW system filed public comments on the matter and worked with our delegation and a national coalition to express concerns that the regulations made the change too quickly and placed challenging fiscal burdens on public institutions. Ultimately, an injunction was issued on the eve of the deadline for compliance. In our federal priorities for 2017, you'll see that we recommend that if the rule proceeds toward implementation, that the automatic indexing of the salary threshold to inflation be removed. The UW system also weighed in on the U.S. Department of Education proposed regulations for teacher preparation programs, which were part of a slate of new regulations advocated by the previous administration. Arguably, and I argue with CSU over this, but Wisconsin really has the best, most long-standing reputation for its strong teacher education and preparation. We voiced our concerns in opposition to a federally mandated prescribed rating system that has marked a significant policy shift in evaluating teacher preparation programs. Already both the House and the Senate have approved resolutions to block implementation of the new teacher preparation regulations, and the White House has indicated that President Trump intends to sign it. The previous administration also worked hard to shed a light on campus sexual assault. It is an issue that has long been very important to the UW system as well, and as you heard, at the board meeting in December, the UW Systems Task Force on Sexual Violence and Harassment unveiled a series of bold initiatives, including mandatory training for all students and employees in the system, and that initiative is being widely applauded. At the federal level, we anticipate that another version of the Campus Accountability and Safety Act called CASA is expected to be introduced in this Congress, and that is something we will continue to follow. So looking back at 2016, I really would say that we dealt a lot with the rise in federal regulation, which has now, I think, going forward, created an opportunity where some of that will be reduced, and I'll talk a little bit more on that in a few minutes. But I wanted to take a look at the federal landscape going forward. I could not be more proud of the influence that Wisconsin holds at the federal level. Speaker of the House, Chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs. We have bipartisan leadership on both the Senate and the House Education Committees. We have representation in both the Senate and the House on the Appropriations Committee, and the list goes on. There are Wisconsinites scattered all across the new administration. I remember Newt Gingrich telling me one time, if he had 2 resumes in front of him and everything else was considered equal, he always hired the candidate from Wisconsin. Why? Because of the Wisconsin's work ethic, he said. And that's really, to me, what's so exciting about having our nation's leadership filled with people from Wisconsin, because we know they'll get it done, and we know they'll get it done right. The new administration and Congress have a lot on its plate. The administration still has hundreds of government-appointed positions to fill, as well as to get a Supreme Court justice confirmed. As the President made clear in his address to a joint session of Congress, one way or another, there'll be a new health care plan, and as you saw this week, Speaker Ryan announced the introduction of the American Health Care Act. The president has said that there will also be tax reform, and whether that means tax reform, tax cuts, or both is open for discussion, and we'll see what happens. There are other significant factors at play. President Trump has stated his intention to focus on immigration and has called for significant reinvestment in the nation's infrastructure. This comes at a time when we are expecting to reach the nation's debt limit, and we are looking at a federal budget that proposes to add more than $50 billion to base defense spending. So if you're looking at this from a higher education perspective, it's hard to say definitively what this will mean, although the increase in the defense budget is going to have to be funded from cuts in discretionary spending. And that's where a majority of higher education and research programs are funded. During his address to Congress, President Trump made a strong pitch for education, calling it the civil rights issue of our time. However, he has said very little to date about higher education, leading many to believe that the Republican-led Congress will have to be the driving force in formulating higher ed policy. Both Chairwoman Fox and Chairman Alexander have said that they want to complete a Higher Ed Act reauthorization bill by the end of the year. But given the magnitude of all the other issues that are on their agendas, it's really uncertain. I would be hesitant to say how quickly that would get done. One area where I think that there is real agreement is in rolling back regulations enacted under the previous administration. And that includes regulations impacting higher education. As I already said, we're already seeing the rollback of the teacher prep regs. So I'm going to go to our proposed priorities for 2017, and they fall along in three buckets. Prioritizing funding for federal financial aid for students, including extension of the federal Perkins Loan Program, which is set to expire in September of 2017, sustained funding for research and development, and relief from burdensome regulations on higher education. I'll take a look at each of those areas just briefly. Financial aid. We'll continue to advocate for sustaining funding for the federal Pell Grant program. That program is the largest federal need-based program providing financial aid for our students. In 2015-16, almost 37,000 Wisconsin resident undergraduate students received a Pell Grant with an average award about $3,800. Without this aid, many low and middle, moderate income students might be priced out of a college education, which is exactly the opposite of what we're trying to do to grow the number of residents with a college degree. Further, to address the growing number of non-traditional students, as well as the push in Wisconsin for three-year degrees, the UW system supports the return of the year-round Pell Grant. It's sometimes called the Summer Pell. It would permit students to receive a third semester of a Pell in an academic year, providing them with greater flexibility and increasing the likelihood of on-time graduation. A bipartisan majority of the Senate Appropriations Committee voted to restore the program as part of its education funding bill in the last fiscal year. The House Appropriations Committee did not include restoration of the year-round Pell in its funding bill, but that was not necessarily because the committee was hostile to the idea. So again, we're still finishing up FY17, so we don't really know the end of that story yet. The UW system also advocates, as I said, for extending the federal Perkins Loan Program, which is set to expire this year, and it potentially could get lost in the shuffle because both the chairman, Alexander, and Chairwoman Fox have said that their higher priority is to reform the overall student financial aid system by simplifying it into one loan, one grant. The UW system supports consolidation efforts as single plans really do make it easier for our students and their families to understand and navigate the complex system. However, if that reform is not completed by September 17, it would be our position to urge our delegation to extend the Perkins program, which serves more than 13,500 students with loans topping more than $25 million annually in our system. So I'll turn briefly to research and development because this is clearly among our top priorities. In 2016, the UW system was ranked by Reuters as 13th among the most 100 innovative universities in the world. I want to share with you, and it's rather ironic that our former speaker talked about the Sea Grant program. The Sea Grant program, the National Sea Grant program, is very important in Wisconsin. It's a federal program out in NOAA. It is dedicated to research, outreach, and education on the nation's oceans, Great Lakes, and coastal resources. In Wisconsin, we have the UW Sea Grant program. It's a statewide UW system program, and we receive nearly $2 million annually in federal funding, and in the form of grants to the UW. But that funding is also matched with contributions from the states and the private sector. The Great Lakes are the largest freshwater system on Earth and support a $62 billion economy and 1.5 million people. In Wisconsin, Sea Grant has served the state for 50 years. We're recognized nationally as, okay, I'm also going to argue with CSU, as one of the leaders in the Sea Grant program. And they impact the Wisconsin Sea Grant impacts include assisting in opening the largest on-land indoor salmon rearing facility in northwestern Wisconsin, helping the National Weather Service refine nationwide severe weather warnings, and saving the world's largest freshwater port millions of dollars in infrastructure costs. According to media reports that we read this week, the president is proposing a 17% cut to NOAA and elimination of Sea Grant. This would be devastating for the program, but also for Wisconsin's thriving coastal ecosystem and communities. The Sea Grant program, of course, is just one example of many, many research endeavors that we do throughout the UW system, largely made possible through federal investments. While decisions have not been made related to the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, the Departments of Ag and Energy, we do know that these decisions are going to be made in a very challenging fiscal environment. Cuts to the funding would potentially put significant UW research at risk, with detrimental effects on our faculty's ability to do groundbreaking research they are known for, as well as our ability to help students engage in research. The American path forward in the global economy is heavily contingent on research and development, and we need to carry that message to maintain our country's competitive edge. Finally, let me talk about the need for regulatory reform, because it really is profound. We're heeding the call of the new administration to reduce mandates, so there's a whole new area to the federal priorities: regulatory reform and mandatory relief. We have heard a lot about the costs of federal regulation on business, but the same is true for higher education. Compliance costs on colleges and universities nationwide are overwhelming. To illustrate, let me refer to national data on compliance recently collected as part of a study of 13 higher education institutions, which includes the whole gamut from public, private, nonprofit, for-profit, four-year colleges, and two-year colleges. The study estimated that higher education institutions report to approximately 18 different federal agencies, comply with about 30 different areas of regulation, and follow more than 200 federal laws and guidelines. In the North Carolina system, for example, compliance activities accounted for 7 to 8% of total campus operating expenses. I would assume it would be similar here in Wisconsin, and these regulations truly do affect our bottom line, as it does for businesses' bottom line. The regulations also hinder our innovation. And I will use the UW flexible options as an excellent example of that. Wisconsin has been in the lead for public institutions and competency-based education. We have a national reputation for that. But because the federal statutes and regulations that have arisen since World War II assume a traditional classroom-based approach to learning, and because federal statutes governing Title IV student financial aid programs still revolve around the traditional credit hour and time on task, providing financial aid to students in competency-based programs has been difficult. We have been to the U.S. Department of Education to get waivers. We've been able to do that. But we hear a lot from legislators at the federal level who want more innovation. And thus, it is necessary, as we are reauthorizing the Higher Education Act, that the statutes and the regs evolve to foster that innovation and provide for faster and less expensive, more affordable pathways to employment. So we need to, as the reauthorization is occurring, create a means for programs like UW Flex Option to innovate. So to address this issue, the UW system strongly recommends streamlining, consolidating, and even eliminating federal reporting and regulatory requirements. As part of our federal priorities report, the UW system has taken a very broad view of the federal regulatory framework, and we've included a comprehensive series of recommendations that we hope will inform future policy deliberations at the federal level. In closing, the UW system's federal framework for 2017 aligns with what is expected to be a new era in American higher education. Our focus is on the following: regulatory reform, reauthorization of the Higher Education Act, including producing faster, more affordable, more innovative pathways through higher education, support for university research and development, and as always, ensuring higher education access, persistence, and affordability. So as other issues arise, we'll work with our higher ed partners and our delegation to review and respond accordingly. And trust me, there is an issue a week that comes up. And we will continue to keep the board involved and look for your support. And thank you very much for your interest in having me here today.
Thank you very much, Chris. And I want to let all of you know that administration has taken this very seriously. On the 24th of February, we had a special meeting with interested parties involved in what's happening at the federal level. I encourage my colleagues on the Board of Regents, if you are going to be speaking with any of our federal representatives, or if you're going to be traveling to Washington, D.C., to please connect with us to talk to us about a unified and a strategic approach to our legislators. What we have now in terms of support for our students with financial aid, with our research grants and monies for special research projects, and also with our regulatory reform, which we have an opportunity to have both cost savings and time savings for our institutions. This is the time that we need to have those conversations. So once again, I encourage you, if you're either going to speak with any of the federal representatives or travel to, please coordinate it a bit with us, with Chris and with system administration. So, Chris, I'm going to thank you very much. And in light of the time, I'm going to also suggest that if we have any questions for Chris, she's available at all times to follow up with us. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
I have a question, not of Chris actually, but kind of about the process. And this is a shame on me, kind of a situation where in reading the the report that we were provided, I was surprised by some of the positions the system has taken. And I note in the introduction to the report that most of this policy has been approved by the board under passive review. And so that I understand is we get a memo from President Cross or somebody in administration that says, here are some policy positions we'd like to take, and if you don't get back to us in 2, 3, 5 weeks, whatever it is, we're just going to adopt those policy positions. Is that correct?
Yes, by and large, it's the passive review for certain legislative actions and also
At the
for-
federal level.
At the federal level, yes.
Okay. And as I'm reading through this, and I note for instance, on page 4, number 3 of the report, one of the things that we're adopting or we're advocating is shifting the federal Pell Grant program to full mandatory funding. And of course, I'm not very familiar with what this means, but what it sounds to me is that we're asking that what I figure is about a $7 billion a year program nationally is shifted from a kind of regular, really re-upping the program, as right now it hasn't been re-upped, to essentially the kind of entitlement that Social Security and Medicare are. Is that correct?
Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah.
Part of the Pell Grant funding is mandatory. There is also Pell Grant funding.
You need a mic.
Part of the Pell Grant funding is mandatory funding presently. There is also discretionary funding. And from the UW system's perspective, the uncertainty of whether the Pell Grant, as I indicated, with the significant deficits, the having to offset cuts under discretionary funding, this creates an uncertainty for students that have to make these decisions about enrolling in higher education earlier than oftentimes the appropriations bills get funded. Bob, is there anything you want to add to that? And so if it would shift to mandatory funding, you could give students and families the certainty that that funding is going to be there at the time when they are looking at enrolling in higher ed.
Thanks, Chris. What I was asking was, does mandatory funding mean that it's an entitlement the same way that Social Security or... Yeah. Okay, so I guess, and thank you very much. The thing that I wanted to raise was that I think, in my mind, the system's policy on this is something that I would have liked to have talked about more. And once again, shame on me for not noticing it when it was put up for mandatory funding. But I'm just wondering if at some point before the last minute, we might consider having an opportunity for the Regents to look at the report as a whole, so that we might have an opportunity to discuss these things ahead of time. So that's all. I'm just trying to think that I do a fairly good job of reading stuff, and I missed this one, and I'm sure I missed some others, and I just thought that maybe the passive review process might be brought to a head at some point prior to having to vote on it or adopt it without any review. Thanks very much.
All right.
Sorry.
Thank you, Tim, for the point, and thank you, Chris, for the point of clarification. Regent Whitburn?
Since Pell Grants have been focused on here, I just want to point to page 4 of the report that's in front of us. Interestingly, in the report and on the slide, we saw 37,000 Wisconsin system students getting a Pell Grant. If you look back a half a dozen years, it looks like 43,000 Pell Grant recipients in our system. My operating assumption is that Pell Grant funding in Washington has not dropped, can you take a second and explain what's going on here? Do we get a block grant and then we divide up how many students as to the dollars? Don't spend a lot of time on it, but just help us understand. Thank you.
Yeah, it just reflects the fact that we have less students that are eligible for Pell. It's still, the federal government provides funding for everybody that is eligible. And so it's just reflecting that the economy has improved since then, and then the number of eligible students has decreased. It's nothing more than that.
So it's not a block grant? It's a
It's-
per student?
Right. The federal government funds everyone that is eligible,
Okay,
unlike the state grants that we only have so much money.
thank you. Thank you for the point of clarification. Are there any additional communications, petitions, or memorials from the Regents? Any? All right, hearing none. Next, I would ask all the board members to stay in place while we complete the roll call vote on the motion to go into closed session. Then the Regents will relocate in the concerto room. Regent Bailey, would you please read the closed session motion?
Okay. I move to consider a UW Parkside and UW Oshkosh honorary degree is permitted by 1985 1F, to confer with legal counsel regarding pending or potential litigation as set forth by 1985 1G, to consider a personal evaluation under 1985 1C and under 1985 1F, to consider the personal histories or disciplinary data of specific persons in the investigation of charges against specific persons, which if discussed in public would have a substantial effect upon the reputation of such persons.
Regent Bailey?
Yes.
Regent Delgado? Regent Erickson? Regent Evers?
Yes.
Regent Farrow? Yes. Regent Greavy?
Yes.
Regent Hall? Regent Higgins?
Yes.
Regent Higgins?
Yes.
Regent Klein? Yes. Regent Langness? Yes. Regent Menedee? Regent Milner? Yes. Regent Mueller? Yes.
Yeah, I wouldn't do it.
Regent Stile?
Yes.
Regent Tyler? Regent Whitford?
Yes.